Welcome, dear friend. Take your time with this. There is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to hold on to, and nothing in the next 2 hours that asks anything of you. Let the room around you grow a little dimmer, even if only in your mind. Settle the weight of your body into whatever holds you. If your shoulders are still carrying the day, let them lower just a small amount on your next slow breath. Breathe in and out. Feel the small warmth at the center of your chest. Let your jaw soften. Let your hands rest open. There is no hurry to anything that follows. We have all the long quiet evening to wander, and all of it for you to drift. Tonight we are going to step somewhere quiet, not into a city, not into a great hall of stone, but into a single low building under a roof of grass, a Norse longhouse, somewhere along the green-gray coast of the North Atlantic, around 1,000 years ago. Picture the door as small. You stoop a little to enter. Inside, the air is dim and warm. A long fire runs down the center of the room, and the light it gives is soft and gold, low to the ground. There are people here, and animals through a wooden partition, and the slow sound of someone working at a loom. Nobody looks up. Nobody asks anything of you. You simply find a place to sit on the long bench against the turf wall, and you let yourself watch. We will spend the night together inside this one long room, listening for the small things that made it home, the carved pillars at the seat of the master of the house, the bowls of milk left out for spirits, the bone skates by the door, the strongest ale of the year set aside for midwinter. There is no tension in any of it, only the quiet weight of a place where a whole family and most of their world lived under a single low ceiling. The wind outside does not concern us tonight. The work of the farm is over for the day. The animals are fed and the lamps are lit. The whole evening is yours, and so is the whole night that follows. Nothing in any of this asks anything of you. You are simply a guest, settled on a bench against a turf wall, watching the fire, listening to the slow, soft sounds of a household drawing in for the night. Settle in. Let the fire be the only thing you need to watch. So picture, gently, the building itself. From the outside, it does not look like much. A long, low mound, almost part of the ground it stands on. Walls of turf, peat blocks the color of dark earth, rising slowly to meet a roof that is also turf, planted with grass that the sheep would graze on if you let them. From a distance, in fading evening light, you might walk past it and see only a swelling in the meadow. The Norse called this style of building a longhouse, a longhouse, and the name describes it almost completely. It is long, it is a house, it is shaped very deliberately like an inverted ship. Step a little closer. The walls are thick, sometimes a meter across. In the Icelandic and Greenlandic farms, built up in layers of cut sod called klombrunás and kvianás, fitted together in a careful herringbone pattern. The Norse who first cleared the fields of Iceland in the late 9th century learned very quickly that timber was scarce here and that turf was not, so they built with what the land gave them. A low stone foundation kept the damp out. A timber frame inside held the weight of the roof, and around it all the soft, dense walls of cut earth grew up like a living shell. The shape of the building is what surprises a modern visitor. A small Viking farmhouse might be only 15 meters long. A wealthy chieftain's hall could stretch to 70 or 75 meters, the length of an Olympic swimming pool, and yet only 5 to 7 meters wide. Picture that, a room you can almost reach across, and yet it goes on and on into the dim. 2 rows of interior wooden posts run down its length, each row spaced inward from the wall, and these posts hold the heavy roof. The rows of posts also divide the inside of the house into 3 long aisles, one wide central aisle where the fire and the seats and the loom stand, and 2 narrower side aisles against the walls where the benches and the work and the sleeping take place. The roof itself is one of the small wonders of Norse building. It does not rest directly on the rafters. First comes a layer of timber boards, then comes a layer of birch bark, peeled in great sheets in the spring when the sap is rising and the bark slips easily from the trunk. The birch bark is the waterproof skin of the roof. It will outlast generations of grass. Over the bark, finally, come the sods themselves, cut from the meadow and laid grass side up. Once they settle, the grass keeps growing. Some Norwegian farms had goats on the roof in summer, trimming the lawn. Houses that were homes to the Vikings simply look from the outside like part of the country. Now step in. The door is small. You stoop a little. As you cross the threshold, the air changes, warmer, denser, slightly smoky. There is a single hole in the roof, far above you, over the center of the long fire. The Norse did not build chimneys. The smoke from the hearth simply rose into the upper third of the room, hung there for a while, and slipped slowly out of the vent. This is the simplest possible way to ventilate a fire, and it has consequences. The air at the very top of the longhouse, even in good weather, was a kind of slow blue cloud. A man standing tall would feel his eyes begin to sting. The children, lower down, breathed cleaner air. The food hanging from the rafters, joints of mutton, smoked fish, small parcels of cheese, cured slowly in the smoke for months at a time. Light, too, came in mostly from above. Through that single smoke hole, a thin column of pale grey daylight would fall onto the floor near the fire, shifting slowly across the day. The doors, when opened, let in more, and in some longhouses the builders left small slits high up under the eaves where the wall met the roof and stretched thin oiled animal membrane across them. Something like a translucent parchment, not glass. Glass was rare and far away, but the membrane let through a soft brown gold daylight, the color of weak honey that could be diffused along the upper wall. On a winter morning, with the doors shut and the fire low, this was the entire lighting of a Norse home. The floor, you might be surprised to learn, was earth, packed and beaten flat, sometimes scattered with sand or small flat stones, sometimes strewn with sweet-smelling herbs in summer. There were no carpets, there were no separate rooms. The whole interior, in a small farm, was one continuous space. Kitchen, dining hall, workshop, parlor, sleeping place, all running in a line along the inside of the long fire. The few partitions there were divided the work area from the byre, the cattle stall, at one end of the building. Even those partitions were rarely walls in our sense, more often a wooden screen, woven panels of withies, or a low fence. A child could walk from the warm center of the house, past the loom, past the carved high seat, past the long bench of sleeping furs, all the way down to where the cows breathed in the cold straw, without ever opening a door. Stand for a moment in the middle of this room. Listen. There is the slow heartbeat of the fire, a soft hiss, the occasional crack of a settling log. There is the dry sound of wool being pulled across an upright loom against the far wall. There is, somewhere down the long room, the slow chewing of an animal in straw. There is wind outside, against the turf, but the turf is so thick that the wind is only a low, distant murmur, like a river you can almost hear. You begin to understand why the Norse called the longhouse a place of fellowship. It is not a building you live in alone. It cannot be. The shape itself gathers everyone toward the warm center. It is worth pausing here to consider how a building like this was actually made, because the labor of construction tells you a great deal about the people who built it. A small farm longhouse, 20 meters long, was the work of a single family across one good summer. The men cut and dressed the timbers, set the corner posts, and raised the roof beams. The women cut the turf strips with a special curved tool called a torfalger, walking the meadow in long, careful lines, peeling up rectangles of sod the color of black earth. The whole household, children included, carried the turf to the building site, one block at a time, stacking the walls layer by layer, beating each course down with the flat of a wooden paddle so the next would settle evenly. A single longhouse might consume the turf of an entire small meadow, perhaps half a hectare of ground, peeled down to the rocky subsoil. After the build, the meadow needed 3 or 4 years to recover. Some families kept a kind of rotating turf allotment, peeling one corner of their land for one house and letting another corner regrow. Land in the Norse mind was not endless. It had to be managed. A longhouse, once built, did not last forever. The timbers rotted in the constant damp from inside and the constant snow from outside. The turf walls slumped over the years, settling into themselves, leaning slowly toward each other. Most longhouses needed a major rebuild every 20 to 30 years. Roof beams replaced, walls reset. A new generation of the same family would, often, simply build a new house on the same footprint, recycling stones from the old foundation, sometimes reusing carved pillars. Archaeologists who excavate these sites find layer upon layer of habitation, 4 or 5 longhouses stacked one on top of the other like rings in a tree. The famous site of Stong, in the Tjörsadalur Valley of southern Iceland, was abandoned only when the volcano Hekla buried it in ash in the year 1104. The pyroclastic flow preserved the building so well that modern archaeologists could measure every post hole, every hearthstone, every divider. The longhouse you can visit today at the Tjordveldisbaron reconstruction nearby is built directly from those plans. In the years after the Norse first reached Iceland, around the year 874, this style of building spread further than anyone might have expected. It went west to the Faroe Islands, west again to Greenland, and finally, briefly, to Lance or Meadows on the coast of Newfoundland, where archaeologists in the 1960s found turf walls in the same shape, the same proportions, the same long, narrow plan, on a coast more than 3,000 miles from where the design began. A Norse woman walking into one of those Newfoundland buildings would have known where to put down her bowl. She would have known where the high seat would be. She would have known which wall was the cold wall and which bench would be hers. The shape was familiar all the way across the North Atlantic. The reconstructed longhouse at Borg in the Lofoten Islands of northern Norway gives perhaps the best modern sense of the scale these buildings could reach. The original at Borg, excavated in the 1980s, measured 83 meters long and almost 10 meters wide. It was the largest Viking-age longhouse ever found anywhere. It had a great hall in the middle, with a long fire and benches and high seats for a powerful chieftain, and at one end a byre that could shelter perhaps 50 cattle. The reconstruction stands today on the same site, faithfully built using period methods, with the same turf walls and the same long fire, and the same dim, smoky, golden interior. To walk into it is to step into the scale of Norse aristocratic life. The space stretches away from you in both directions. The roof is so high that the smoke takes a long time to find its way to the vent. The benches along both walls run for what feels like the length of a small ship, and in the middle, the carved high seat pillars rise to twice the height of a man, dark with old wood and bright with painted bands. A small farm longhouse and a great chieftain's hall were the same building, only scaled. The grammar was identical. The vocabulary was simply richer at the top. There is something deeply moving in this geographic continuity. From the wind-swept skerries of the Faroe Islands to the green meadows of southern Norway, from the volcanic plains of Iceland to the cold coast of Greenland, from the trading towns of the Baltic to the briefly settled outpost at Vinland in North America, the Norse carried with them, in the shape of their houses, a single architectural idea. A long room, a central fire, benches against the walls, a high seat in the middle, animals at the far end, turf or thatch above, the same shape again and again, wherever the longships went. A culture, quite literally, took its house with it across an ocean. But long before any settler thought of crossing oceans, the building's first job was much simpler. It was to keep a single family alive through winter, and under that long, low roof, there was always one more sound than you would expect, closer than the wind, warmer than the fire, breathing somewhere on the other side of a thin wooden screen. Walk a little further down the central aisle, past the long fire, past the wooden screen at the far end of the hall. The air changes. It grows cooler. The smell shifts. Earth, hay, the dry, warm scent of livestock. You have come into the byre, the cattle stall, and you are still inside the same building. This is the part of Norse domestic life that most surprises a modern visitor. The animals lived through the wall, not in a barn outside, not in a separate shed across the yard, but at the far end of the longhouse itself, separated from the family's living space only by a wooden divider that could be opened and closed at will. In good weather, the partition might be drawn back to give a clearer line of sight along the building. In foul weather, in midwinter, in long cold weeks when nothing moved outdoors, the partition stayed closed, but the warmth of the cattle still seeped through. Their breath, slow and heavy, became part of the air in the hall. Their slow chewing was part of the night sound. In Iceland, the design went a step further. There, in many longhouses, the byre was dug down into the ground beneath the living quarters. The cows stood below, on a sunken floor of stamped earth, while the family lived directly above on a raised wooden platform. The body heat of the animals, and a single cow gives off a remarkable amount of warmth, rose up through the boards into the human room. It was the closest thing the medieval North Atlantic had to central heating, and it ran quite literally on grass and patience. The Norse household, on a working farm, kept a small zoo. There were cattle, of course. The wealth of the family was counted in cows. There were sheep, sometimes by the hundreds, grazing the upland pastures all summer and crowding into the byre for winter. There were pigs, which liked to root in the woods and were largely left to themselves until autumn slaughter. There were horses, small and sturdy, and not much taller than a modern pony, which ploughed and pulled and carried. There were chickens, fewer than you might think, more for eggs than for meat, and there were dogs, large rough working dogs that herded sheep and warned of strangers, and smaller hearth dogs that simply slept against the warm wall. A recent study published in the journal Viking, produced under the wing of the University of Oslo, modeled the entire settlement of Iceland around the cooperation needed to keep cattle alive in a place with no native woodland. The conclusion was striking. The longship may have brought the Norse to Iceland, but it was the cow that shaped what they built once they arrived. Farms had to be close enough to share grazing in summer and shelter in winter. Neighbors had to be willing to lend a bull, lend a hand, lend a wagon. The whole pattern of Icelandic settlement, the dispersed farms, the small communities, the long winter alliances, grew out of the simple need to keep a herd alive in the cold. The cow, in a sense, drew the map. Inside the longhouse, the social order followed a similar logic. The closer your bench was to the central fire, the higher your standing in the household. The family of the master of the house sat near the high seat at the warm center. Distant cousins, hired hands, and visiting traders sat further out toward the cooler ends. Thralls, the enslaved members of the household, of whom we will speak more in a moment, slept nearest the doorway, in the coldest, draughtiest part of the building. There was no need to label any of this with a sign. You walked into a Norse hall, you saw who sat where, and you understood the social geometry within a moment. A wealthy chieftain's hall might shelter 30, 40, even 50 people across 3 generations of the same extended family. Grandparents on the warmest bench, parents and grown children on the next, younger children and unmarried siblings further out, Hired farmhands, servants, traders passing through, foster children, for fostering was a common Norse arrangement where a noble child might spend their teenage years in the house of an ally, all of them slotted into the long line of benches by quiet, unspoken rank. Even the dogs had places. The favorite dog of the master might be allowed at his feet by the high seat. A working sheepdog slept further down, beside the kitchen quarter. A new pup might be tucked into a basket near a child's bed for warmth. The animals themselves, on the other side of the partition, had their own quiet hierarchy. The milk cow, the most valuable creature on the farm, had the warmest stall. The breeding sow, the broody hen, the workhorse all had their corners. A barren cow or a sickly sheep might be moved further from the others, closer to the cold outer wall, and in the long cold months, the thin wooden divider between humans and animals became less and less important. People reached through it to throw straw. Children climbed over it on errands. A nervous lamb, born too early, might be brought through it altogether and laid in a basket beside the hearth, where the family could keep an eye on it through the night. We sometimes picture earlier peoples as living closer to nature in some abstract romantic way. The longhouse shows what that closeness actually looked like. It was not a pastoral painting. It was a low building of turf, where a baby slept 3 meters from a cow, where the smell of straw and the smell of bread were always mingled, where the same hand that scratched a child's hair also led the milking ram out at dawn. There was nothing sentimental about it. There was only the quiet arithmetic of survival in a cold place. That warmth shared is warmth doubled. That lives close together cost less. That a roof big enough for everyone is the most efficient roof there is. Consider for a moment the specific creatures themselves. The Norse cow was not the cow you would picture today. It was small. A modern Holstein dairy cow stands 1.5 meters at the shoulder. The Icelandic cow of the Viking-age, descended directly from the Norwegian breeds the settlers brought in their longships, stood barely 1.10 meters at the shoulder. It was shaggy. It had short curving horns. It produced perhaps 3 or 4 liters of milk a day in good summer pasture, perhaps barely 1 liter in deep winter on dry hay. By modern standards, it was an inefficient animal, but it was a hardy animal. It could survive on coarse grass that a modern cow would refuse. It could endure a winter standing in straw in a half-buried byre. It was, exactly, the cow that this place could feed. The Norse horse was even more striking in its smallness. The Icelandic horse today, descended unchanged from those Viking-age stock, stands roughly 1.30 meters at the shoulder. It is, technically, a pony by modern measurement, but it has 5 gaits where most horses have 3, and it can carry a full-grown adult through deep snow and across boggy ground that would mire any larger horse to its knees. The Norse rode these small horses everywhere, to the assembly, to trade, to battle, the horse and the cow together, both small, both shaggy, both impossibly tough, were the engine of the household. Pigs occupied a slightly different position in the household economy. Unlike cattle and sheep, which needed to be kept close in winter and hand-fed on stored hay, Pigs largely fended for themselves. In the warmer months, they were turned loose into the woods or onto the rough scrub on the edge of the home meadow, where they rooted for acorns, beech nuts, fungi, roots, and any small carrion they could find. They went half feral. They came home, more or less, when called for the evening slop. They were not pampered animals, but by autumn, after a summer of hard rooting, they were fat and ready for the season's slaughter. A single Norse pig killed in October gave the household salted bacon, smoked ham, blood pudding, sausage, lard for cooking, and bristles for brushes. Almost nothing was wasted. Even the bladder, blown up and dried, became a child's ball. Pigs were the autumn windfall of the Norse farm. Chickens, brought into Norse Scandinavia along the trade routes from the south, were a relatively recent addition to the longhouse. They were kept mostly for eggs rather than meat, since a laying hen was more valuable alive than dead. They roosted on the rafters above the byre at night, where the warmth from the cattle below kept them comfortable, and they wandered the floor of the longhouse during the day, scratching for crumbs near the long fire and pecking at insects in the straw. Children chased them, cats stalked them, dogs ignored them. They were in many longhouses the most chaotic feature of the household, the small darting bright presences that wove between everyone's feet through every meal of every day. Sheep were the third pillar. Of all the animals in the byre, sheep were the most numerous. A successful Norse farm might keep 200 sheep, 300, sometimes more. Sheep gave wool for clothing, milk for cheese, meat for the autumn slaughter, hides for blankets, tallow for soap and lamps. A sheep was, in a very real sense, a small portable factory. The Norse farm without sheep was a farm slowly going hungry. Most of the household's labor, especially the women's labor, in any given week, went into managing wool, carding it, spinning it, weaving it, dyeing it, fulling it, sewing it. The byre was the source, the loom was the furnace, the wadmal cloth was the output, and the same sheep that gave the wool, also in autumn, gave the night's mutton. By the time the long winter night fell on a Norse farmstead, the whole household was inside. 2 or 3 families, a dozen sheep, half a dozen cattle, a handful of horses, a few chickens, the dogs, the cats, the visiting bard, the elderly aunt, all of them under one long roof, all of them within shouting distance of the same fire. The Norse did not have a separate word for home the way modern English does. They simply called it the bar, the farm, and the farm was everywhere you could hear the long fire crackling. There is one further consequence of this animal closeness that the Norse felt every spring. When the snow finally melted and the days lengthened, the cattle were turned back out to pasture, the byre was emptied, the wooden divider was taken down for cleaning, and the floor of the byre was scraped clear. The household saved every basket of the resulting compost, the rich black mixture of straw and dung that had built up through the long winter, and spread it across the home meadow as fertilizer. The grass grew thicker for it. The hay yield was higher because of it. The cycle of warmth in winter and food in summer ran, in a real sense, through the same animals, the same byre, the same long fire, the same family, Nothing was outside the cycle, nothing was wasted, and the closer you sat to the fire, the more clearly you could see the carved pillars at the heart of the room. At the very center of the long room, halfway between the door and the bier, stood a place that mattered more than any other. It was not a throne. It was not even, by modern standards, especially elaborate. It was simply a wider portion of the long bench against one wall, slightly raised, sometimes set back into a shallow alcove, flanked on either side by two carved wooden pillars. This was the onvegi, the high seat, and the pillars beside it were the onvegi-sulla, the high seat pillars. In a wealthy Norse household, these pillars were the most beautiful objects in the building. They might be carved with twining serpents and stylized beasts, with the long-jawed face of a god, or with the interlaced patterns the Norse loved, patterns that the Christian scribes of later centuries would borrow for the margins of their gospel books. The wood was usually oak or elm or ash, brought from the mainland forests of Scandinavia, expensive in places like Iceland, where trees did not grow tall. The grander the pillars, the higher the family standing. A jarl's pillars might be twice as tall as a small farmer's. A poor household might have only painted posts, but every longhouse had something, some marker that said, "This is the seat of the master, and this is where the household begins." The pillars were not only decoration, they were also, in a real sense, the spiritual center of the home. The 13th century Eyrbyggja saga describes pillars holding what it calls riginaglar, the god nails or the power nails, driven through the wood to anchor the divine into the house. To touch the pillars in oath was binding. To deface them was a deep insult. To move them was to disturb the household's luck. And here is the small thing that surprises a modern listener most. When the first Norse settlers reached Iceland in the late 9th century, looking for a place to put down a new farm in a country none of them had ever seen, some of them did not choose by the look of the land. They did not choose by the depth of the soil or the closeness of the harbor. They chose instead by where their pillars washed up on the beach. The story is preserved in the Landamabok, the Book of Settlements, the medieval Icelandic record of who arrived where. As a longship neared the Icelandic coast, the head of the household would carry his onvegi-sulla up onto the deck, lift them, and throw them into the sea. The ship would then sail along the coast, and crewmen would walk the shoreline for days, sometimes weeks, looking for where the pillars had drifted ashore. Wherever they were found, that was where the gods wanted the household to settle. That was where the new farm was built. The most famous case is Ingolfur Arnason, traditionally credited as the first permanent Norse settler in Iceland around the year 874. He threw his pillars overboard somewhere off the south coast, then sent 2 enslaved men of his household, Vifil and Kali, to walk the shoreline searching. 3 years passed. The pillars were finally found in a small bay on the southwestern coast, under a thin column of geothermal steam rising from hot springs nearby. Ingolfur called the place Reykjavik, the Smoky Bay, a national capital, chosen by a piece of drifting wood and the patience of 2 men walking a beach. We do not know how many other settlers really did this, and how many merely told the story. The Landamabok was written down 200 years after the events, in a country becoming Christian and looking back at its pagan grandparents. But the very fact that the story was treasured tells you what the Norse thought a household was. It was not the people, it was not even the building, it was the spirit anchored in those two carved pillars, a spirit you could carry across an ocean in the bottom of a ship and trust the gods to plant where it should grow. At the high seat itself, the master of the house sat in the middle. His wife or partner sat beside him, usually on his left. The most honored guest sat directly opposite, across the long fire, on a smaller raised bench called the Ondvejimina, the lesser high seat, so that the two could speak to each other across the flames. This is why so many Old Norse poems and sagas describe conversations conducted across a fire. The high seat made it geometric. Around them, along the benches, sat the rest of the household, and how that household was arranged tells us something about Norse society more clearly than any law book. The poem Rígsthula, preserved in the Codex Wormianus, tells a mythological story of how human beings came to be sorted into three classes. The god Rig, usually identified with Heimdall, wandered the world disguised as a traveler and stayed 3 nights in 3 different households. From each a child was conceived, and from each child a different class of human beings descended. The first house was a poor cottage. The man and woman who lived there fed Rig coarse bread and broth. Their child was named Thrail, the thrall. From him descended the Thrailer, the enslaved people of Norse society, who did the heavy and unpleasant work of every farm, hauling firewood, mucking out the byre, hand grinding the day's grain. Some thralls were captured in raids, others were born into the condition. Some eventually bought or earned their freedom, for Norse law did allow it, but most lived their lives without owning the bench they slept on. The second house was a comfortable farm. The man and woman fed Rig a good meal of porridge and meat. Their child was named Karl, the free man. From him descended the Karlar, the great backbone of Norse society. The free-holding farmers, the craftsmen, the small traders, the people who owned their own land and made their own decisions. Most listeners to this story would have been Karlar themselves. The third house was a fine hall. The man and woman fed Rig roasted bird, white bread, and good wine. Their child was named Jarl, the Earl. From him descended the Jarlar, the warrior aristocracy, the chieftains, the eventual kings. Jarl learned to ride, to hunt, to read runes. His descendants ruled. Inside a longhouse, you could see all 3 classes at once, because they all slept under the same roof. The Jarl, if he was the master of the house, sat at the high seat in the warm center. His Karlar, his free farmhands, his guests, his cousins, sat along the benches on either side, the closer the more honored. His thralls slept by the door. The coldest air came through that door whenever it opened, the first wind off the snow, the first wet of the rain. A thrall woke at every footstep. A Jarl heard nothing until morning. It is worth saying something here about the women of the household, because in much of medieval Europe, a woman's place in a household was tightly controlled, but in Norse society it was rather different. A Norse woman of the Carl class could own property in her own name. She kept the keys of the household, often quite literally, on a ring at her belt, and these keys to the storage chests and the food stores and the wool cupboards were the visible symbol of her authority. She could initiate divorce simply by declaring it before witnesses at the door of her own house. She could inherit land and pass it to her children. If her husband died, she could continue to run the farm, and many widows in the sagas do exactly this. The famous Aud, the deep-minded, daughter of a Hebridean chieftain, led her own settlement expedition to Iceland in the late 9th century, after her husband and son both died, brought her household and her thralls and her livestock in her own ship, and chose her own land in the Breiðafjörður region. Her grandchildren became some of the most prominent families in early Icelandic history. The high seat in her hall was hers, not borrowed. There is something quietly humane in this arrangement, even in its harshness. There were no separate huts for the enslaved, no slave quarters out behind the manor. The household was a single household. Everyone heard the same fire, the same songs, the same children crying in the night. The injustice was geometric, not invisible. You could see it in the bench arrangement, and in the rare cases where a thrall earned freedom and became a carl, the sign of the change was simply that they were given a better seat. There is a saga episode that captures the openness of Norse women standing rather neatly. In Laxdala saga, the great matriarch the deep-minded, the same Aud mentioned a moment ago under her other name, summons her household to her bedside as she nears death. She has chosen the day, she has chosen the hour. She has invited all her foster sons and grandsons to a great farewell feast at her hall. She greets each one personally. She gives gifts. She pronounces blessings. She leaves the table to retire to her sleeping room, where she lies down with quiet dignity and dies in her sleep on her own terms, in her own house, surrounded by the people she has chosen. The saga records the details with deep approval. A good death, the Norse felt, was a death where you chose the time and the company. A good life, in the same view, was a life where you chose the household you ran. Both, for a Norse woman of standing, were genuinely possible. A thrall, on the other hand, lived a life that we would today recognize as slavery in nearly every detail. The thrall was property. The thrall could be bought and sold. The thrall's children by default inherited the thrall status, and yet within this harsh frame, the Norse legal codes recognized certain protections that we might not expect. A master who killed his own thrall without cause owed compensation, not to the thrall, who was beyond compensation, but to the wider community for the disturbance to good order. A thrall who saved a master's life might be granted freedom on the spot. A thrall who bought their own freedom by accumulating small payments over years was called a leysingi, a freedman, and entered a new social position halfway between thrall and carl. They could not yet sit at a carl's bench, but they could marry. They could by their own labor eventually become kalla in the next generation. The line between bondage and freedom in Norse society was strict but not absolute. A clever, lucky, hard-working person could cross it within a single lifetime. The seat itself was a teaching tool. A child growing up in a longhouse learned the geometry of rank simply by sitting in it. He learned which guests deserved the bench opposite the master and which deserved a place further down. He learned how to greet a visitor at the door and where to lead them to sit. He learned the small social grammar of who carved first from the joint of mutton, who passed the ale horn next, who spoke first when a question was asked of the household. None of this was written down. None of it had to be. The longhouse taught it every evening to every child in turn, simply by being shaped the way it was shaped. The bench was the school, and once everyone knew their seat, the slow business of an evening could begin. In the films, in the cartoons, in the souvenir shops of Reykjavik and Bergen, the Viking is almost always pictured holding a horn of mead. Mead, that golden honey wine, has become the symbol of the Norse, almost as recognizable as the longship and the helmet. It is one of the small comforts of history that most of those images are gently, lovingly wrong. Mead was real. The Norse drank it. They prized it. They wrote poems about it. But it was not what most people drank most days. The everyday drink of the Viking household, the drink that would have been on the long bench beside the bowl of porridge, the drink in the wooden cup of a child of 8, the drink poured for a laborer at midday and again at the long dusk meal, was ale. Ale was the working liquid of Norse domestic life. It was brewed from barley, the most reliable cereal of the cold north, and made in great quantity in the late summer when the harvest was in. A normal household batch of ale was around 2 to 4% alcohol, much weaker than a modern beer, weak enough that even children drank it, weak enough that a farmhand could drink it through the day and still cut hay in a straight line. There was a practical reason for this beyond pleasure. Drinking water in a settlement of dozens of people and tens of animals, with all the runoff that implied, was risky. Brewing the water into ale, boiling it, fermenting it, made it safe. Most farms brewed for safety as much as for taste. What gave the Norse ale its taste, however, is the part most modern beer drinkers find strange. Hops were not yet standard in Northern Europe. The bitter green flower that gives a modern beer its sharp, dry edge had not yet conquered the brewing world. Instead, the Norse flavored their ale with a mixture of herbs called grut. Every region had its own grut. The most common ingredient across most of Scandinavia was bog-myrtle, also called sweet gale, a low resinous shrub that grows in wet meadows and on the edges of bogs. To it, brewers added yarrow, wild rosemary, juniper twigs, and sometimes a little heather. The result was an ale that smelled faintly of damp grass and pine and warm earth, closer to a forest after rain than to anything you could buy today. It would taste, to a modern palate, herbal, almost medicinal, but deeply familiar in its own way, and it would have been the smell of every kitchen in the Norse world. Mead, by contrast, was a luxury. To make mead, you needed honey, and honey was rare in a country with short summers and few flowering trees. Wild bees were hunted in the woods, A single hive might be the year's only source. In Iceland, where bees did not yet thrive, honey had to be imported at high cost from the mainland. Mead brewing was slow, long fermentations, careful storage, and one batch tied up a great deal of honey. So mead was kept for the moments that mattered. A jarl might serve it at a betrothal feast. A skald might be paid in it after composing a great poem. A successful trader, returned from a long voyage, might break out the household's mead horn for the welcoming dinner. To drink mead was to mark an occasion. To drink ale was to live a life. Beyond these two, the household drank water from the spring or stream, the cold, hard water of the north, often silty in spring melt, often peaty by color. They drank a thin, sour milk called surra, drained and slightly fermented, popular in summer. They drank whey from the cheese-making, the cloudy byproduct of curd pressing, which a thirsty farmhand might down by the bowl. And they drank on cold nights hot infusions of berries and herbs steeped in water. Not tea exactly, since the tea plant was unknown, but the same idea. Warmth, a small flavor, a quiet ceremony at the end of a day. Now consider what the Norse household ate. The diet of a longhouse was simpler than we might think, and richer than we might expect. The two main staples were grain and milk. Grain came as porridge, as flatbread baked on a hot stone beside the long fire, and as the small, dense, round loaves the Norse called broad. Milk came as fresh milk for children, as butter, a great deal of butter, salted and stored in wooden casks underground for winter, and, most importantly, as skyr. Skyr deserves its own moment. It is a strained, cultured dairy product, similar in form to a thick yogurt or a soft, fresh cheese, made by warming milk to a precise temperature, adding a culture, letting it set, and then draining the whey. The Norse made it by the bucket. They ate it at every meal. They sweetened it with berries in summer, served it sour with porridge in winter, and stored barrels of it in cool stone pits to last the dark months. And here is the small piece of trivia that most surprises a modern listener. Skyr is not gone. It is still made in Iceland today, sold in plastic tubs in every supermarket in Reykjavik, and shipped around the world as a high-protein health food. A 9th century Icelander set down in a modern grocery store would walk past the bread and the cheese and the wine without recognizing any of it, and then she would stop in front of the dairy case, pick up a tub of skyr, peel back the lid, and know exactly what she was holding. The protein on the table varied with season and place. In autumn, after the slaughter, there was fresh meat, mutton most commonly, beef when a cow was old or barren, occasionally pig, occasionally horse. Most of it, however, was not eaten fresh. It was preserved. Strips of mutton hung in the smoke of the long fire for months at a time, slowly drying, slowly darkening, becoming the chewy black tannin-rich meat the Icelanders still call hengikjös. Whole sheep were buried in salt or in barrels of sour whey, where the lactic acid pickled them into something that would last a year. Fish, cod, herring, salmon, trout was air-dried in the cold wind on wooden racks until it became the rock-hard pale yellow stockfish that traveled the medieval world as a trade good. Cooking happened almost entirely in and around the long fire, a heavy iron cauldron, the household's most expensive single piece of equipment after the loom, hung from a swinging chain over the center of the pit. Into it went the day's stew, a handful of barley, a piece of dried mutton, a wedge of root vegetables, a pinch of salt, if the household could afford salt, which it could not always afford. Salt in the Norse world was a luxury, evaporated laboriously from seawater in shallow stone pans on coastal farms, traded inland in small precious packets. Households without easy access to the sea preserved their food not with salt, but with the lactic acid of sour whey, the smoke of the long fire, or the cold dryness of a stone-lined storage pit. The stew simmered all morning. By the dagvudr, the day meal, it was thick and ready. By the natvudr, the night meal, what remained had been topped up with fresh ingredients and simmered all afternoon. The same cauldron in some households ran continuously from breakfast to bedtime, an ever-changing slow-cooked broth that was always there when someone was hungry. Vegetables were fewer than we might expect. The Norse grew cabbages and turnips and a little flax, gathered onions and leeks where they could, dug wild celery on the coast, and foraged in the woods for sorrel, juniper berries, and the small tart wild blueberries that ripen on the moors in late summer. A bowl of porridge with a swirl of skyr on top, a piece of dark salted mutton, half a cup of weak ale, and a handful of berries. This would have been a perfectly normal evening meal in a longhouse. 2 such meals a day, midday and dusk, structured the rhythm of every household. It is worth describing the brewing process itself, because so much of a Norse household's late summer was given over to it. After the harvest, when the barley was in and threshed, the household began the malting. Wet grain was spread on the floor of a low, warm building and allowed to germinate, just barely, for 3 or 4 days. The starches in the grain converted to sugars. The sprouts were stopped by drying the malt over a low fire, often the long fire of the longhouse itself, where the grain absorbed the soft smoky note that gave Norse ale its particular flavor. The dry malt was cracked between stones, then mashed in great wooden tubs of warm water. The sweet liquid that drained off, called the wort, was boiled with the groot of bog-myrtle and yarrow. Then the cooled wort was pitched with yeast, often a yeast strain held in the family for generations, kept alive in a wooden stick called a kvake, that was passed from one batch to the next. Norwegian farmsteads still preserve some of these kvik strains today. Modern microbiologists have analyzed them and found yeast lineages that genetic dating suggests are well over 1,000 years old. The yeast that brewed an ale for an Iron-age Viking is, in some farms, the same yeast brewing an ale for a Norwegian farmer this winter. The brew itself fermented for 1 or 2 weeks in covered wooden barrels. By late autumn, when the first frosts came, the year's ale was ready. Some of it was set aside, the strongest of the strong, in special barrels for Yule. Some was tapped at once for the harvest feast. Most was simply stored in cool stone-lined pits beneath the longhouse floor to be drawn off as needed through the long winter months. A medium-sized farm might brew several hundred liters in a single autumn, enough to last every member of the household until next year's brewing season. Meals in a longhouse followed a quiet rhythm. There were 2 main meals a day. The Norse called them the dagverder, the day meal, taken in mid-morning after the first work of the day, and the nattverder, the night meal, taken at dusk before the lamps were lit. Between these meals, people might pause for a small bite of bread or cheese, or a cup of ale, but the 2 main eating times were the structuring beats of the household's day. At the dagverder, the long fire was already burning, the porridge was hot, and the work of the morning had built up a hunger. At the nattverder, the day's tasks were done, the byre was settled, and the family gathered along the benches in their accustomed order. The food was passed in wooden bowls from hand to hand. Each adult ate with their personal eating knife, drawn from the sheath at their belt. Children ate with small wooden spoons. Conversation was quiet at first, then warmer as the ale circulated. By the end of the night meal, the room was as full of words as of food, and while the cup went round and the wooden bowls were passed slowly along the benches, the smaller lives of the longhouse moved quietly along the walls. Lower your gaze for a moment from the high seat and the tall carved pillars. Look down toward the floor. Look toward the corners of the room. Look toward the small, easily overlooked figures who in any longhouse on any winter night made up half the population of the building. The children, the dogs, the cats, the new lambs, the very old. The world inside the longhouse was not only the world of the master and his bench, it was also the world of the people and creatures too small to take a high seat, and of the things they did to fill the long hours. Children in Norse society were everywhere underfoot. Birth rates were high. Infant mortality was higher. A woman might bear 8 or 10 children and see only 4 reach adulthood, so a Norse household always had small ones in it. Newborns swaddled in soft wool, toddlers crawling on the packed earth floor, 6-year-olds learning to spin a small spindle, 10-year-olds sent to fetch water from the spring in carved wooden buckets. They were not separate from adult life. They were folded into it. What did they play with? Archaeology has recovered surprising answers. The most common Viking-age children's toy in the archaeological record is the small wooden horse. Tiny carved wooden horses have been found in Dublin, in Trondheim, in Staya Ladoga deep in modern Russia, in the Faroe Islands. Wherever the Norse went, children carried their wooden horses with them. There were also wooden swords for the boys to brandish at each other across the byre, miniature longships small enough to float in a bowl of water beside the hearth, dolls of carved wood with painted faces and woolen hair, little bone whistles that produced a single sweet note. There were rattles for babies, small clay or wooden balls with a pebble inside. A recent excavation at Fjordur Farm in Seyðisfjörður in the eastern Icelandic fjords turned up something especially charming. Among the floor finds of a longhouse was a small carved volcanic rock figure of an animal less than the size of a thumb, dated to between 940 and 1000 of the Common Era. Archaeologists looked at it. Archaeologists argued about it. Some said it was a bear. Some said it was a pig. Some said a horse. Nobody quite agreed. The likeliest reading is that it was a child's small toy, perhaps the only toy that child had, carried for a few years, and then dropped on the floor and lost beneath a bench, where it lay quietly under packed earth for 1,000 years until somebody's trowel found it again. Bone ice skates are another find that takes a modern listener by surprise. The Norse made winter skates from the long leg bones of horses or cattle, a metacarpal or metatarsal, smoothed and shaped, with a leather thong drilled through one end to lash the bone to the foot. These bone skates were not sharp. The wearer did not push off the way a modern skater does. Instead, they held a long stick in both hands and pushed themselves across the ice the way a punter pushes a flat-bottomed boat across a river. Hundreds of bone skates have been found in Sweden alone, at lake settlements, at frozen river crossings, at the edges of winter villages. Children skated on them, so did adults. Some of the recovered skates show the smooth, glossy wear of decades of use. They were the household's winter wheels. Indoors, when the dark closed in early and the long, cold weeks began, families played board games. The most popular was Hnefatafal, the King's Table. It was an asymmetrical strategy game played on a checkered board, in which a small king and his defenders attempted to escape from a larger besieging army. The king sat at the center of the board on a marked square. His defenders were placed around him. The attackers were spread along the four edges. Each side took turns moving pieces along the rows and columns, the king's side trying to reach a corner, the attackers trying to surround him. Hnefatafl was the Viking equivalent of chess, and indeed it was largely replaced by chess only in the 11th and 12th centuries, as Christian Europe brought the new game north. But for centuries before that, Hnefatafl was the great winter game. One archaeological site in northern Britain has yielded almost 100 game pieces. Boards have been carved into the surfaces of stones at trading posts. Skaldic poems mention the game alongside drinking and song. Children were also given, from a remarkably young age, real tools and real responsibilities. A 6-year-old might already be tending lambs in the home meadow, learning the names of the household sheep, helping turn the hand quern at the morning grinding. A girl of 9 could spin a respectable thread on a small drop spindle. A boy of 10 might be sent on horseback, alone, to deliver a message to the next farm 2 hours away. There was no separate childhood the way there is in modern life. No extended period of pure play and pure schooling. Children worked. They worked alongside adults. They learned by watching and by doing. By the time a Norse child reached 15 or 16, they were considered, more or less, an adult member of the household, ready for marriage, ready for the assembly, ready for whatever came next. This did not mean they were treated harshly. The sagas, when they mention children, are full of small, affectionate details. A father teaching his son the names of the constellations on a clear winter night. a mother singing a child to sleep on the long bench, a grandmother carving a tiny wooden boat for a grandchild's birthday. Norse children were, by all the surviving evidence, deeply loved within their households. They were also by necessity useful. Fosterage was a particularly Norse arrangement that connected households across long distances. A child of one family, often a noble child, would be sent at the age of 7 or 8 to live in the household of a friend or ally for several years. There they would learn skills, gain new connections, and form bonds of obligation that would last a lifetime. Fostering bound two families together as tightly as a marriage. The foster parent and the foster child remained, for life, kin in a meaningful Norse sense, expected to come to each other's aid in any quarrel. Many famous figures in the sagas were foster children of someone equally famous. The arrangement made the entire scattered Norse world a single web of mutual obligation, connected one foster bond at a time. Beyond the children, the household had its other small lives. The dog, large or small, was everywhere, sleeping against the warm wall, following children outside, guarding the byre, herding the sheep. Norse names for dogs were affectionate and specific. Viti for a white dog, Trigger for a faithful one, Vigi for a fierce one. Cats had come into Norse homes from the south, brought along the trade routes from the Mediterranean as ratters, and they kept the grain stores clear of mice. Genetic studies of modern Scandinavian cats trace some lineages back to ship cats of the Viking-age. In a longhouse, a cat might sit in the rafters, in the warm, smoky upper third of the room, and watch the household below through narrow eyes for hours. Cats, in particular, have left a curious genetic trail. A 2017 study published in the journal Nature, Ecology and Evolution examined ancient cat DNA from archaeological sites across Europe and the Mediterranean. One of its findings was that domestic cats spread north into Scandinavia largely on the decks of Viking trading ships. A particular DNA marker common in cats from Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean appears suddenly in Norse archaeological sites in the 8th and 9th centuries, then spreads outward through the Baltic and the North Atlantic in lockstep with Viking trade routes. Modern Norwegian forest cats, with their thick double coats and tufted ears, descend in part from these Viking ship cats. They are large, they are placid, they tolerate cold remarkably well, and they are, genetically, the descendants of cats once carried in the holds of longships from the warm ports of the south, brought aboard to keep the grain stores clear, settled at last in the rafters of a turf-walled longhouse on the edge of the Arctic. Dogs, by contrast, were almost certainly with the Norse from the very beginning. Burials of Norse warriors and chieftains often include a dog, sacrificed and laid alongside the body to accompany the master into the afterlife. Other burials include the bones of horses, falcons, even the occasional bear. The famous Oseberg ship burial of around the year 834 in southern Norway contained the remains of 2 women buried in great state alongside more than a dozen horses and several dogs. Whatever the Norse believed about the afterlife, dogs were apparently part of it. The hearth dog of the longhouse, dozing against the warm wall through the long winter evenings, was not just a pet, it was a creature of significance, a loyal companion in this life, and, the household believed, a guide of some kind in the next. The very old too occupied their own corner. A grandmother who could no longer carry water might still sit by the long fire with her spindle, slowly twisting wool into yarn, talking with whoever sat beside her. A grandfather who could no longer ride to the assembly might still mend wooden tools and tell stories to the children. The Norse word for an elder, elri, simply meant the older one. Old age was respected, but it also had to be useful. The household carried its grandparents because the grandparents carried the household's memory. There were also, in the smallest corners of the longhouse, things you would not notice unless you were looking for them. Small clay or wooden bowls left out at night, with a little milk or butter set by the door or in the corner of the byre, offerings to the Vatir, the land spirits who were thought to live in the rocks and hills, and to bless the household if treated well. Small wooden figures of Thor or Frey tucked into a niche above a sleeping bench, the remains of last year's juniper sprig, dried to brown, hanging from a rafter as a charm against bad luck. None of these things were grand. None of them were lit by torches. They were the quiet, half-noticed devotions of an ordinary house. And at the center of it all, as everywhere in this building, the long fire continued its slow, low burning. The children fell asleep against the warm wall. The dog stretched and turned. The grandmother let her spindle drop to her lap. The cat blinked. Far above, in the smoke, there was finally, in every longhouse, a quiet acknowledgement that not every small life made it through to morning. The Norse infant mortality rate was high. A baby who was sickly at birth, a baby who would not feed, a baby who arrived in a winter when the household could not afford another mouth, sometimes did not survive. The sagas record the painful Norse practice, mostly abandoned by the 11th century, but remembered for centuries afterward, of exposing unwanted infants on a hillside or by a stream where the land spirits, the Vatir, were thought to take them. A child set out in the cold did not always die. Sometimes a passing traveler picked the infant up and brought it to a different farm, where it was raised as a foster child of that household. Sometimes a kinder member of the original family relented and went out at dawn to bring the baby back. The practice was always uneasy. It was banned at the Christian conversion in the year 1000. But for centuries, in the quiet corners of the longhouse, this was a small grief that some households knew, and it was a part, however hard, of what it meant to live so close to the edge of survival. And as the small ones drifted, the slow technology that kept the house alive hummed on. A longhouse, like any home, ran on its small invisible technologies, the fire that warmed it, the lamps that lit it, the loom that clothed it, the pots that fed it. None of them were complicated by modern standards. All of them were essential, and in the half-dark of a Norse winter evening, the slow, patient hum of these small machines was the heartbeat of the place. The fire came first. The langaldra, literally the long fire, was the central feature of every Norse hall. It was a stone-lined rectangular pit running for several meters along the central aisle of the building, sometimes just a single hearth, sometimes a row of 2 or 3 connected pits in the longest halls. It was not built up against a wall the way a modern fireplace is. It sat in the middle of the room. It threw its heat outward in every direction. Benches lined both long sides. People could warm both faces of their hands at once, standing astride one end. A cooking pot could hang from a chain over the center of the pit. A skewered joint could roast at the side. A round flat stone could be pushed in close to the embers for baking flatbread. The fire was kept going almost constantly through the cold months. To let it die was a small disaster. Relighting required striking flint against fire steel into a tinder of dry birch fungus, which on a damp day could take a long while. So the household tended the fire the way a modern household tends the boiler. The last person up at night banked it carefully, pushed the live coals to the center, covered them with ash, laid 1 or 2 small logs in for the slow night's burning. The first person up in the morning broke the ash crust, blew on the coals, and fed in fresh kindling. The fire crossed the night the way a cat does, coiled, breathing, patient, never quite asleep. Around it, the cooking gear was simple and durable. Iron cauldrons hung from chains. Smaller iron pots sat in the embers. Wooden bowls and ladles, carved wooden plates, knives. Every Norse adult carried a personal eating knife on their belt, which they used both for cooking and for table. Spoons of horn or wood, trenchers, flat slabs of stale bread that absorbed the gravy and were eaten last. There were no forks. There was very little ceramic. Most of the household's gear was wood, iron, or horn, 3 materials the Norse worked superbly well. Now consider light. We have already mentioned the smoke hole and the dim brown daylight that filtered through the membrane windows under the eaves. By midwinter in Iceland or northern Norway, daylight lasted only 4 or 5 hours a day. The longhouse, for 2/3 of every day in December, was lit not by sun, but by fire and oil. The chief artificial light, beyond the central fire itself, was the soapstone lamp, a small carved bowl of steatite, sometimes hung from a chain, sometimes set on a flat stone shelf. Soapstone was easy to work with simple tools. It was abundant in many parts of Norway. It held heat well and did not crack when warm oil was poured into it. A famous example from Shalshof, on the southern tip of Shetland, slightly post-Viking in date, around the 12th and 13th centuries, but identical in form to the Viking-age lamps that came before, shows a small open bowl perforated on both sides for a hanging cord. Into the bowl went oil. On the surface of the oil floated a wick of twisted flax or wool. The wick drew the oil up by capillary action and burned at the tip. The fuel was whatever the local coast yielded. Cod liver oil was a favorite, clean burning and almost odorless. Lipid residues recovered from inside Viking-age lamps show traces of fish oil, seal oil, even fulmar oil, the oil of a North Atlantic seabird that was rendered from the bird's body and stored in casks. 2 teaspoons of cod liver oil in such a lamp could burn for over an hour with a clear, soft yellow flame about the size of a thumbnail. It was not bright by modern standards. A whole longhouse, lit by half a dozen such lamps, was darker than a modern living room with a single bulb. But it was enough to see your hands. It was enough to weave. It was enough to spin. It was enough to carve. It was enough to keep the work of the house going through the long polar evenings when nothing else stopped. Against one wall stood the loom. The Viking loom was a warp-weighted loom, an upright frame of 2 tall posts joined at the top by a horizontal beam. From this beam hung the warp threads in long bundles, each bundle tied at its bottom to a heavy clay weight. Roughly 28 clay weights would hold 1 yard of cloth in tension. A wider loom, and the Norse built looms up to 4 meters wide, needed proportionally more. The weaver, almost always a woman, stood in front of the loom and worked with her arms raised, passing the weft thread in a wooden shuttle through the gap in the warp, beating each new pass tight with a long, flat, sword-shaped tool called a weaving sword. On a wide loom, 2 weavers worked side by side, stepping back and forth, passing the shuttle between them. The cloth they made was wool, almost always, heavy, durable, slightly greasy with lanolin still in the fiber, naturally water-shedding. The most common form of finished cloth was wadmal, the thick, coarse wool fabric that clothed the entire Norse population. Wadmal made tunics, trousers, leggings, capes, blankets. It was strong enough to use a ship's sail. It was warm enough for a Greenland winter, and in medieval Iceland, wadmal was so essential, so universally produced, that it became the country's currency. Land was paid for in lengths of cloth. Fines were measured in ells of wadmal. Taxes were rendered in bolts. The loom against the wall of a longhouse was not just furniture, it was a mint. Wool itself, before it ever reached the loom, was a long story. The sheep were sheared in early summer, the fleece pulled off in great soft greasy mats. The wool was washed, only lightly, to keep some of the lanolin in the fiber, then carded with paired wooden combs to align the strands. The carded wool was rolled into soft clouds called rolags, ready for spinning. Spinning was done with the drop spindle, a simple weighted stick that a woman could carry in her pocket and use anywhere. Walking to fetch water, sitting beside the long fire, even out in the home meadow watching the sheep, a Norse woman spun. The thread accumulated on the spindle slowly, hour by hour, day by day. To produce enough yarn for a single tunic took weeks of steady spinning. To produce enough for the household's annual cloth needs took most of a year. The spindle whorl, that small weighted disc at the bottom of the spindle, is one of the most common archaeological finds at any Norse site. They are found in numbers that simply demonstrate how constantly, how universally, how inescapably women spun. Dyeing, when it was done in great wooden vats outside in the summer. Norse dyers had a small but vivid palette, madder root from the south for soft red, woad leaves for blue, fermented in stale urine until the dye broke through, local lichens for purples and browns, heather and birch bark for yellow, onion skins for warm gold. The dyed wool was then woven on the upright loom into the patterned clothes the Norse loved, including the small bands of tablet-woven trim called stick trim, which decorated the edges of cloaks and tunics with intricate geometric designs. A wealthy Norse woman might spend many evenings of a winter weaving such trim, working with 20 or 30 small wooden tablets through which the warp threads passed, twisting them in careful sequence to produce the patterns. The trim of a fine tunic could take a month to make. It was the embroidery of the Norse world. A particularly fine example of a Viking-age oil lamp was executed at Birka, the great trading town on the island of Bjorkö in Sweden's Lake Mälaren. The Birka lamp, dating to the 9th century, is a low cup-shaped soapstone vessel with 3 small projecting feet that allowed it to stand on a flat surface. Its bowl is shallow but wide. Its rim is smooth from long use. Lipid analysis of similar Birka period lamps has identified the fuel as marine mammal oil, probably seal, indicating that the trading town imported oil from the northern coasts as a regular commodity. A house in Birka in the year 870 might have been lit then by oil that began its life in the body of a seal hunted in the cold waters of northern Norway, rendered in casks, shipped down the long coast, traded across a busy harbor, poured into a small soapstone cup, and burned at last beside the bench of a craftsman working late into the polar night. The whole long supply chain of the medieval North hung, in a sense, from a single thumbnail of yellow flame. There were other small machines too, the hand quern, 2 flat round stones, one above the other, the upper turned by a wooden handle, ground the day's grain. It was almost always operated by women, and by thrall women in particular, because the work was hard and unending. Wooden tubs and barrels for butter and cheese and ale, soapstone molds for casting small bronze brooches and pendants, iron tongs and small anvils for the household smithing, for almost every farm did its own basic smith work, mending tools, sharpening blades, making nails. The longhouse, when you began to see it as a system rather than a building, turned out to be one of the most efficient pieces of low-technology engineering in the medieval world. A single roof, a single fire, a single source of light, multiplied by a few small lamps, a single loom that produced the household's clothes and currency at once, a single buyer that made the household's heating self-renewing through the breath of its cattle. Nothing wasted, nothing duplicated, the whole building turning slowly through its day on the small power of fire, breath, hand and oil. Tools and tasks accumulated quietly in every corner of the longhouse, and a careful look around the walls revealed a great deal about the household's particular work. A leather worker's bench would carry awls of iron and bone, knives with curved blades for skiving hide, wooden mallets, and the long, thin needles for stitching. A woodcarver's corner would hold gouges of various sizes, a small hand axe, a bow drill for boring holes, and a stack of unfinished pieces, perhaps a half-carved bowl, perhaps the beginnings of a child's wooden horse. A blacksmith's corner in farms that did their own ironwork would have a small stone anvil set into the earth floor, a pair of long tongs, hammers of various weights, and a leather bellows pumped by a child to bring the fire to forging heat. The longhouse was not just a home, it was a workshop, several workshops in fact, all sharing a single roof and a single fire, all running quietly through every short winter day. The smell of the longhouse, finally, was something that no modern visitor could quite prepare for. It was a layered smell, built up over years, the faint sweetness of the smoke, the deeper warmth of the cattle through the wall, the salt note of the curing fish hung from the rafters, the lanolin grease of the wool drying on a wooden frame, the yeasty round note of the brewing tubs, the damp earth of the turf walls themselves, never quite dry, the faint herbal sharpness of the Groot ale, the thick milk smell of the skye in its cool stone pit, the dog by the fire, the lamp's burning fish oil, the newborn lamb in a basket beside the bench, all of it together, all of it permanent. The smell of a Norse home was the smell of every part of a Norse life, and to step out of the longhouse into the cold winter air was, for a moment, to leave a thick and complicated world for a thin and simple one, and beyond the warm circle of lamplight, smaller things were tucked into corners that mattered more than they looked. The religion of the Vikings, in the popular imagination, is a religion of huge wooden temples, of hooded priests, of bonfires on hills, of long processions of armed warriors swearing oaths over heaped offerings. Some of that is true. Some of that did happen, especially at the great seasonal festivals at Uppsala and Ledre, but most of the religious life of an ordinary Norse household happened indoors. It happened on a small wooden shelf in the corner of the hall. It happened in the bowl of milk left at the door. It happened in the hand laid against the carved high-seat pillar before a journey, in the muttered word over a baby's cradle, in the small offering tossed into the hearth on the first cold morning of autumn. Norse religion was, above all, domestic. This is partly because the Norse did not have, in most places, a strong organized priesthood the way the Christians who would follow them did. There were godar, local priest chieftains, who served as both religious officiants and political leaders, and there were larger temples called hof in some parts of Scandinavia. But these were not the everyday religion. The everyday religion was practiced by the head of the household with the help of his wife or partner on behalf of everyone under the roof. The longhouse was the temple, the high seat was the altar, the fire was the offering. A small shelf or niche somewhere in the hall, often near the high seat, sometimes above the doorway, sometimes carved into the side of the high pillar itself, held the household's small wooden figures. These were the household gods, a figure of Thor perhaps, short, broad-bearded, holding a tiny hammer carved into one fist, standing for protection against storm, sickness, and the giants of the wild places outside. A figure of Frey, usually shown with prominent fertility, standing for the harvest, for the new lambs in spring, for peace and for plenty. A figure of Odin, older, one-eyed, leaning on a staff, standing for wisdom, for victory, for the dead. The figures were small, often only the size of a human hand, sometimes carved from soft soapstone, sometimes from wood. Several have been recovered intact from Norse sites. The famous Eyrarland statuette from northern Iceland, a seated bronze Thor 7 centimeters high, is now in the National Museum of Iceland. Beside the figures stood small wooden bowls. Into the bowls went offerings, a little of the household's bread on baking day, a spoonful of butter from a fresh churn, a pour of new ale from the autumn brew, a small piece of the first mutton from the autumn slaughter. Nothing elaborate, nothing expensive. The point was not to give the gods grand things. The point was to share. The household ate, the household offered. The gods were folded into the daily life of the place. After a day, an offering was tipped into the long fire as a small libation, and the cycle began again. Outside the longhouse, in similar small bowls left near the door or at the corner of the byre, were offerings for a different sort of being. The Vatir, the land spirits, who were thought to live in the rocks and the hills and the streams, and who could either bless the household or, if neglected, curse it. The Vatir were not the great gods, they were the small ones, the local ones. Every farm had its own. A successful farm was one where the Vatir were content. A failing farm was one where, somehow, they had taken offense. Stories abound in the sagas of farmers who moved the path of a stream and offended a stream spirit, or who built a house on a stone where an elf was said to live, and suffered failed crops and dead lambs as a result. The simplest preventive medicine was to leave a small bowl of milk or a piece of butter at the right spot every few days, and to apologize quickly if anything offensive was done. There were also the Alfar, the elves, who might live in a hill near the farm, or in a single great stone in a meadow. There were the Disir, the female ancestral spirits of a family line, sometimes thought of as the spirits of female forebears, sometimes as guardian goddesses of a household. A particular festival called the Disablot was held once a year in late winter or early spring to honor the Disir of the household. It was held indoors near the high seat, with sacrifices of small animals and pourings of ale. The smell of the offering, mingling with the smell of smoke from the long fire and the breath of the cattle through the partition, must have given the longhouse a particular thick warmth on those nights. The most visible religious act in any Norse household was the blot, the formal sacrifice. A blot might be small or large. A small one might be the slaughter of a single chicken or a small lamb at the corner of the hearth, with the household watching and the blood collected in a bowl. A large one at midwinter Yule, or at the autumn equinox harvest, or at the spring sowing, might involve the slaughter of a horse or a bull. The animal's blood, called halaut, was caught in a bowl. A bundle of twigs, called the halautine, was dipped into the bowl. With this bundle, the head of the household sprinkled the blood onto the walls of the hall, onto the carved pillars and the small figures of the gods, and finally onto the people themselves, marking each in turn. The meat of the sacrificed animal was then cooked and eaten by the household, who understood that they were sharing the meal with the gods. The blot is one of the most striking moments of Norse religion to a modern observer, not because of the sacrifice itself. Most pre-modern peoples had something similar, but because of how closely the form of it resembles a much later Christian rite. The Christian aspergillum, the small bundle or rod used to sprinkle holy water onto a congregation, has almost exactly the same physical motion. Blood becomes water, the same sweeping wrist, the same quiet expectation of the people sprinkled. When Iceland converted to Christianity in the year 1000, a great deal of the old sacred grammar was simply translated into the new vocabulary. The fire stayed, the bowl stayed, the motion stayed. Only the meaning shifted. There is a beautiful saga episode that captures the household quality of Norse worship. In Iceland saga, a settler named Thorolf Mostbeard, who has fled Norway with his household and his sacred high seat pillars to find a new land, throws those pillars overboard as he nears the Icelandic coast. The pillars in his case carry the carved image of Thor on them. He follows them ashore and lands at the place the sea has chosen. He builds his hole there. He sets up his pillars, and into them he drives the riginagla, the god nails, with great ceremony. He then dedicates the entire promontory of land around his farm as a sacred place, called Helgafell, the Holy Mountain. No one is to die a violent death there. No one is to relieve themselves on the mountain. No blood is to be shed on its slopes. The whole farm becomes in effect a small temple, and the household lives within the temple grounds simply by living their daily lives. To eat there is to worship. To work there is to worship. To sleep there is to worship. The everyday became the sacred by location alone. This is perhaps the deepest expression of what Norse domestic religion really was. Not a separate moment in the day, not a separate building on the hill. The whole farm, the whole longhouse, the whole life, taken as one continuous offering to the gods of the place. Different gods were called on for different problems. Thor for storms and farming, Frey for harvest and peace, Odin for war and wisdom. A farmer might toast Thor against bad weather and never bother Odin at all. Each household had its own small constellation of favored deities, depending on the family's history, the land they farmed, the trades they pursued. A coastal household whose men sailed for trade might keep a careful relationship with Njord, the sea god. A horse-breeding farm might honor Freyr, who was associated with horses among many other things. Religion was not one thing. It was 100 small things, kept alive in 100 small homes, each one slightly different, each one tuned to the needs of the particular family. The conversion of Iceland to Christianity in the year 1000 was, by the standards of European religious history, a remarkably gentle event. It was decided not by armies but by argument at the Althing, the great open-air assembly that the Icelandic chieftains held each summer at Thingvellir. Two factions had grown up: the Christians, mostly merchants and travelers who had picked up the new faith on voyages abroad; the pagans, mostly older households still loyal to the old gods. By the year 1000, both sides were arming themselves. A civil war was nearly inevitable. The chieftain entrusted to make the final ruling, a man named Thorgil Losvetningagodi, was himself a pagan priest. He retired to his booth at the assembly. He laid a fur cloak over his head. He stayed under that cloak for an entire day and night, thinking. The next morning he emerged and gave his ruling. All Iceland would convert formally to Christianity. Public sacrifice would be banned, but 3 quiet exceptions were granted. Eating horse meat would still be allowed. Exposing unwanted infants would still be allowed, and private worship of the old gods behind closed doors would not be punished. With these compromises in place, both sides accepted the ruling and went home. Civil war was averted. The longhouses that very evening kept on burning their long fires. The little wooden figures of Thor and Frey on the household shelves were not, in most homes, taken down at once. They were simply moved a little further into the corner for 2 or 3 generations, until the last of the old believers died. The household religion of Norse Iceland was practiced in private, slowly fading, while the new Christian faith grew up alongside it in the open. The transition happened quietly, without bloodshed, because most of the worship had always been domestic anyway. A god moved from a shelf to a chest, and life went on, and there was finally the central post of the longhouse itself, the great high pillar that held up the center of the roof, the structural heart of the building. It was not just structural, it was thought to channel the household's luck. To remove it was to disturb the household's fate. To cut into it was to risk a curse. When a household moved house, for the Norse did sometimes move, when the soil failed or the family grew, the central post might be carefully removed and carried to the new building, where it would be erected first, before any walls went up. The household followed its post. The post followed the household. The two together made a home, and as the offerings settled and the gods were thanked, the house at last began to slow towards sleep. Now picture the long winter evening drawing in. The wind has been blowing all day across the field, but the turf walls are so thick that inside the hall it sounds like a faraway river. The cattle on the other side of the partition have settled. The children have stopped their last small running back and forth. The grandmother has put away her spindle. The lamps are lit. 6 small soapstone bowls of cod liver oil, throwing soft yellow circles of light along the benches. The long fire has been fed for the night. The household is, slowly and almost without anyone deciding it, beginning to gather toward the warm center. This is the hour, in a longhouse, when stories begin. The Norse called the storyteller a skald, a poet, but more than a poet. A skald was a memory keeper. He could recite the whole genealogy of the household back 6 generations. He could recite the long sagas of the founding voyages, of the journey of Eric the Red to Greenland, of Leif Erikson's brief landing on the coast of Vinland 1,000 years ago. He could recite kennings, the dense, beautiful Norse poetic riddles in which the sea was called the whale road, and battle was called the sword storm, and gold was called the otter's ransom. He could compose new poems on the spot, in praise of a host or a successful voyage. He carried in his head, without writing, a library that today would fill several long shelves. This is one of the small wonders of Norse culture. None of it was written down at the time. The whole literature of a civilization, the cosmologies, the gods, the family histories, the laws, the love poems, the songs, lived for centuries entirely in the heads of skalds, passed mouth to mouth, learned by long apprenticeship. It was not until the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, in a now Christian Iceland, that the great manuscripts were written down. The prose Edda, the poetic Edda, the sagas of Icelanders, Egil's saga, Njal's saga, the Heimskringla, all of it, before it became ink, was breath, and the place where it was kept alive, evening after evening, was the longhouse. A traveling skald might arrive at a farm at dusk in midwinter, brushing snow off his cloak. He would be welcomed with a horn of ale. He would eat at the master's table, and then when the meal was cleared and the children quieted, he would stand by the fire or sit on a low stool and begin. Sometimes the recitation went on for hours, sometimes it went on for nights. A long saga might be told over a whole week of winter evenings, an episode each night, the household waiting expectantly for the next chapter. It is no accident that storytellers were especially welcome in winter. From November to March, in much of the Norse world, outdoor work largely stopped. Snow blocked the roads. Boats were drawn up on shore. The sheep stayed in the byre. The cows stood in their stalls. Whole weeks could pass when nobody left the building except to fetch water from the spring, and the household was thrown back, again and again, on its own company. A good story made the long evenings bearable. A skald in the house was treasured. A skald who could keep a household entertained for 2 weeks of January was paid in silver and remembered for life. Some skalds were so famous that their names have come down to us across 1,000 years. Egil Skallagrimsson, the great rough-edged poet of Borg in Iceland, who composed his most famous poem, Sonnetirek, in mourning for his drowned son. Sigvat Thordarson, court skald to King Olaf the Holy of Norway. Bragi Boddason, the very earliest skald whose work survives, active in the 9th century, perhaps the originator of the kenning style itself. These were not faceless figures. They were known. Their poems were memorized by 100 households at once. A traveling skald carrying the latest verse of Egil from one farm to the next, in the depths of an Icelandic winter, was the equivalent of a modern radio bringing a new song to a remote village. People waited for him. They cleared their best bench for him. They listened with the quiet hunger of people for whom new words were genuinely rare. The oldest of the great Icelandic sagas were not, however, written by skalds. They were written, beginning in the late 12th century, by a quietly remarkable group of Christian scholars working in monastic and noble households across Iceland. The greatest of these was Snorri Sturluson, who lived from 1179 to 1241. Snorri was a chieftain, a law speaker, a politician, and an immense polymath. From his estate at Reykholt in western Iceland, he composed the prose Edda, which gathered the Old Norse mythology into a single work, and the Heimskringla, which gathered the histories of the Norwegian kings. Without Snorri, we would know perhaps a tenth of what we now know about the religion and history of the Viking world. The longhouse stories that the skalds carried in their heads for centuries became books because Snorri and his contemporaries decided just in time to write them down. There were other entertainments too. The board game Hennefatafla was set up between two seated players, and a knot of household members crowded round to watch and second-guess each move. Riddles were exchanged, drinking songs were sung, slow, steady, communal songs in which everyone joined the chorus. Dice games of chance, played for small bone counters or for forfeits. Small contests of memory and verbal wit. The Norse loved their words. A clever insult well delivered was admired almost as much as a clever poem. And then there was Yule. Once a year, deep in midwinter, the household held the great feast of Jol. We tend today to assume that Yule lasted 12 days, the same 12 days as the Christian Christmas. But this is a later overlay. The original Norse Jol, attested in Hakonar Saga Goda, the saga of Hakon the Good, which describes events of the 10th century, was a feast of 3 nights at midwinter. 12 days came in only after Christianization, formally fixed at the Council of Tours in the year 567. Modern pagans have borrowed the 12-day frame back, but the Norse themselves held a shorter festival. 3 nights, however, was no small thing. The strongest ale of the year, the malt brewed back in late summer, set aside through autumn, finally tapped at midwinter, came out for Yule. The best meat was slaughtered for the table, and at the center of the feast was a particular animal, the Sonargolta, the boar sacred to Frey, the god of fertility and harvest. The Sonargolta was led into the hall on the first night of Yule. Each member of the household placed a hand on its bristly back and swore an oath, a vow for the coming year. Then the boar was sacrificed, and its meat became the centerpiece of the Yule feast. The hall was full, the fire was high, the skald sang his best poems. The carved pillars at the high seat shone in the lamplight. For 3 nights the household ate, drank, told stories, swore oaths, and remembered who they were. The Yule oath itself, the height-strenging, was a particular Norse institution. To swear an oath at Yule, with one hand on the bristly back of the Sonargolta boar, and a horn of the strongest ale in the other hand, was binding in a way that few other oaths were. The oath was witnessed by the whole household, by the gods of the hall, by the spirits of the ancestors, and by the boar itself, who would carry the oath into the next world with him at his sacrifice. People swore great things at Yule, to take vengeance for a father's killing within the year, to go on a long voyage, to win the hand of a particular woman, to compose a poem of a particular subject, to clear a new field, to make peace with an enemy. The sagas are full of Yule oaths, some kept and some broken, and the breaking of a Yule oath was considered one of the gravest possible failures of honor. To stand under the carved pillars on the first night of Jol, with the firelight on your face and the ale warm in your hand, and to swear a great thing in front of everyone you knew, was to set the shape of your coming year in a way few other moments could. The Yule feast also gave rise to a small folk tradition that has survived, in changed form, into the modern Scandinavian Christmas. The Yule goat, the the Jolbuk, was originally connected to Thor, whose chariot was drawn by two great goats named Tangrisnir and Tangristos. At Yule, in some Norse households, a straw goat was made and stood in the hall as a symbol of Thor's protective presence over the feast. After Christianization, the figure persisted. It became eventually the small straw Christmas goat that still appears in Scandinavian homes every December, and the giant straw goat that the Swedish town of Gävle puts up in its town square each year, where it is, as often as not, mysteriously burned to the ground by unknown arsonists before Christmas Day. The Gävle goat is, in the strangest possible modern sense, the last visible descendant of Thor's chariot in the streets of contemporary Europe. After Yule, the hardest part of winter still lay ahead. The dark continued, the snow deepened, the wind kept blowing, and the household, fortified by the feast and the warmth of being together, settled back into the slow rhythm of getting through to spring. There was, in addition to all of this, a great deal of quiet music in a Norse longhouse on a winter evening. The Norse instruments were simple and warm. The small wooden lyre with 5 or 6 gut strings, plucked or strummed gently by anyone in the household who could play. Small bone whistles, easy to carve, easy to learn, capable of a few sweet folk tunes, a drum of stretched hide, a simple wooden flute. The skald's recitation was often half sung, the lines falling into a slow chanted rhythm that listeners could follow even if they were not paying close attention. Communal songs were sung at the close of each long evening, the whole household joining the chorus, the children half asleep on their parents' laps mumbling the familiar words. The Norse loved music in the way a household loves the small habitual things of its own daily life, not as performance, not as concert, just as the natural sound a home makes when its people are gathered. When the time came at last for sleep, it came as quietly as everything else in the longhouse. There were no separate bedrooms. There were no beds in our modern sense. For most people, the wall benches that had served as seating during the day became sleeping platforms by night. A stack of woolen blankets was unrolled. A fur or two was thrown over the top. People settled in their accustomed places, close to the fire if their rank allowed, further out if not, near the door if they were a thrall. Some wealthier households had enclosed box beds along the wall, small wooden cabinets with a bench inside and sliding doors that could be drawn closed for privacy and added warmth, the medieval Norse equivalent of a tiny bedroom. But most slept on the bench, in the open hall, in the same air as everyone else. The lamps were turned down or covered. The fire was banked, the door was barred for the night, the long room grew dim. The smell of the day, smoke, wool, milk, mutton, oil, ale, animal, settled into a single quiet warmth. Outside the wind kept blowing, the grass on the roof bent under the wind, then sprang back. The cattle through the partition shifted in the straw. A dog sighed. A child turned over. The skald, on a bench against the wall, closed his eyes. And so as the embers settled and the house grew quieter still, and so the longhouse begins to dim. The lamps that were hung along the walls have been pinched out one by one, leaving only a single small flame above the high seat to mark the center of the room. The long fire has burned down through the long evening to a low bed of red coals, banked under a soft blanket of grey ash. There is no flame now, only the slow-breathing glow of a fire about to sleep. The smoke that hung in the upper third of the hall has thinned. The vent above the hearth shows, somewhere very high up, a single faint patch of stars. The household has gathered into its sleeping shapes. The master and mistress are in the box bed nearest the high seat, the wooden panels drawn most of the way closed. Their grown sons and daughters lie on the long benches on either side, wrapped in furs and woolen blankets, breathing slowly. The grandmother is closer to the fire than anyone, propped against a soft folded sheepskin, her spindle put away on a small shelf at her shoulder. The children are in a row along the warmest stretch of bench, tucked under a single great fir, 3 of them sleeping in a tangle, one of them with a small wooden horse still loose in his hand. The thralls are in their own row by the cooler outer wall, near the door, but tonight even the air by the door is mild. The wind has dropped, the night is gentle. Through the wooden partition at the far end of the building, the cattle shift in their straw. A cow lows softly, then is quiet. A horse blows out a long, slow breath. The dog at the foot of the master's bench lifts its head once, listens, lays it down again. The cat in the rafters has long since stopped watching. Somewhere in the smoke-blackened beams, a small mouse, satisfied that the household is at last asleep, slips out of its corner to look for crumbs. Outside, the snow has begun, very gently, the way midwinter snow does in this part of the world. Soft, dry, almost weightless. It settles on the long sloping roof of the longhouse, on the green grass that grows up there even in winter, and slowly the whole building disappears under a soft white blanket. From the air you would not be able to see it at all. Only the faint blue line of smoke from the vent would tell you that anyone was inside. The longhouse becomes part of the landscape. It always almost was. There is nothing here that needs your attention, nothing here that needs to be remembered, nothing here that needs to be done. The household sleeps, the fire sleeps, the animals sleep, the snow falls, the roof keeps everyone warm. The night is long and quiet and complete. Let the warmth of that long room come gently into your own room now. Let it rest along your shoulders. Let it sit at the small of your back. Let it pool softly in the palms of your hands. There is no work for you to do. The fire is already banked. The door is already barred. The household is already asleep. You are simply here, lying still, breathing slowly, while a 1,000-year-old building keeps a 1,000-year-old quiet under a 1,000-year-old roof of grass. Now let your breath slow. The fire is low. The hall is quiet. Let your shoulders soften. Let your jaw soften. Let your hands rest open. There is nothing more to hold on to. The snow falls. The roof keeps you warm. The fire is low. The hall is quiet. Let your eyes close. Sleep well. Sweet dreams.